Welcome. This is Pilgrim Interviews, a place to ask good questions to good authors. I am Guilherme Cordeiro. I am an editor here at Pilgrim, and my guest today is North American Anglican priest and author Tish Warren. Pilgrim has published Liturgy of the Ordinary in Portuguese as Liturgia do Ordinário, and will soon publish Prayer in the Night as well, her latest title, as Oração da Noite. Today, we will ask her some questions about these two books. So, how are you, Tish, today?
Good. It's really good to be with you.
Where are you speaking from? I heard you moved a little bit around the country.
I did. I just moved just over a month ago. So I am near Austin, Texas. I'm in a small town right by Austin, Texas. So I'm still very far from you, but closer than I was because I moved from Pittsburgh.
Pitts in the Sparburg.
So Pittsburgh is farther from Brazil than Texas is. So, yeah.
Nice. So, so let's start with Liturgy of the Ordinary, okay?
Okay.
Now, this is your book. I think you have received it.
Yeah, I have. I've seen it.
Yes, as you can see, we did a little change because we don't have a lot of peanut butter and jelly here. This is a sandwich that we call misto quente and coffee. I think you know how famous Brazilian coffee is.
I loved the Brazilian cover so much. You captured the idea of it, and it's been really fun actually because the Liturgy of the Ordinary is in, I can't remember actually, it's like 6 or 7 languages, maybe more now. And to see all the different covers, to see what ordinary looks like for different cultures has been really, really, yeah.
2 thumbs up for contextualization, huh?
What?
2 thumbs up for contextualization, right?
Yes, exactly. That's right. And I think the Indonesian version has a bowl. There's a bowl of rice in it.
Yes, I have seen it.
Yeah, so I like to see what ordinary brings to mind for graphic designers in different countries. So, yeah.
So, well, Tish, why did you write this book?
Well, I began liturgy. All the books I write, actually, it's just everything I've written has been out of my own kind of struggle, my own what I am learning, kind of my own exploration of what I feel like I'm learning in the Christian life. And so I had been raised, particularly in high school and college, in kind of a Christian subculture that was really focused on kind of doing big things for Jesus. I don't think that's the way we would have said it, but that's what we meant. And being kind of radical and taking risk for the gospel, which is very good. But the sort of the dark side of that was we didn't know how kind of this call to being radical kind of mixed with being overachiever. And because I went to kind of a overachiever kind of college, and we didn't know how the Holy Spirit, how walking with Jesus looked in an ordinary life, in a regular life. And so we wanted to kind of do things for God. And I had, I'd gone overseas and worked as a missionary. I had worked here with folks in poverty and on the street in particular, and had at times like experimented with living in Christian communities, and but I had found myself. My husband entered graduate school, so this was my late 20s, early 30s, and I was had 2 kids and was, we were in America in a regular home with a mortgage, and I realized I felt a much higher degree of anxiety on a regular day than I did in some of the things that I'd done that seemed really risky. I was in East Africa for a while, and there was guerrilla warfare where I was, and I was less anxious on a given day than it felt like in my life, even though my life was much safer. And I thought, why is this? And part of it that I realized is I just had no idea. I had no idea what it looks like for my life to have meaning in the kingdom, in the actual context I was in, doing the actual things I was doing. And I didn't know how to walk with Jesus in my ordinary life. And so that was sort of happening at the same time that it was kind of around the same time that I was new to Anglican. I was becoming Anglican from kind of a much lower church, Baptist evangelical background. So I was discovering all this idea of liturgy and formation and how spiritual practices form us, how we're formed by our habits, even outside of quote unquote spiritual practices, how our habits, like checking our iPhone over and over again, or how those things shape us and form us. And so I was reading, there was a spate of books about kind of why ordinary life mattered. And they were good and they were important books. But it actually just was sort of that ordinary life mattered. And it didn't explain why. And I was wrestling with, okay, so ordinary life matters, but why and how? And what does that mean? And so what I came on is this idea of formation, of incarnation, Jesus' incarnation, and the ordinary years of Christ's life, how that grounds the redemption of all of our ordinary lives, but then also the idea of formation. And I really drew largely from James K.A. Smith and his work in a book called Desiring the Kingdom, which he's since kind of summarized in a book called You Are What You Love. But so I drew from his ideas, but I wanted to say, what does this look like in just in the most ordinary day and the smallest form? And so it was really a way for me to I wanted to push pause on these moments and say, what kind of formation is happening right now? What is happening in this? How is God at work in this very moment? And so that Liturgy of the Ordinary gave me a chance to do that. It was a way to sort of walk through a day and pause and look at how these daily things are shaping us.
Yeah, and it's funny for you to mention your background, because we are seeing something similar happening here in Brazil. So we are seeing a growing ressourcement of the church liturgical tradition, written prayers, the church calendar. And we have a lot of people preoccupied in a country marked by religious conflict between Roman Catholics and Protestants, that this may be a relapse into Catholicism. What would you say about that? Why should a Baptist or a Pentecostal read this book?
Yeah, it's funny, actually. Someone this week who was a missionary, not in Brazil, it wasn't in Brazil, but in a different part of South America, said to me, she now goes to an Anglican church, and said, I have no idea what it would look like to present these ideas in that context, because so many people find their identity as not Catholic, as a sort of against, so often where they grew up, or in response to that. So here's what I would say. All churches have a liturgy, whether you want them to or not. So it's not, you can't not have a liturgy. I grew up in a church that would have really understood itself as almost anti-liturgical, against sort of what you're saying, against anything that felt Catholic. But if I was sick one Sunday and stayed home, I would still be able to tell you within about 5 minutes of accuracy what was happening at a church at a given time, right? Because we had an order, and even friends of mine who are from very, very kind of charismatic Pentecostal churches, they're still is a way that that's done. There's an order, and we know it because when people come in who are from that tradition, they know what's happening. They understand, oh, okay, this is where people are standing now, people are shouting now, people are not now, people are kneeling now. Because these same things happen kind of often. And it's because we as human beings are shaped indelibly by our repetitive practices and habits. You cannot think everything. Originality is certainly a blessing, but constant originality is inhumane, because and neuroscience now is bearing this out. Most they say about 90% of our activities in daily life are pre-conscious or subconscious and are habitual. And so all that to say is that all that I would say liturgy are repetitive formative practices, and all of those three words matter. So practices are things we do. In every church, we have things we do, right? We stand at hymns, we sing. And formative means these things shape us. So they're not just ideas, they're things that shape who we are. They shape our hearts, they shape our imaginations, they shape our ideas, certainly, but also our activities, our actions, and our emotions and our spirits. And then they're repetitive. We do them again and again. And so in this sense, it's impossible to avoid liturgy in your church. But the question is, what is that liturgy from? Where did it come from? And what is it shape? How is it shaping you? So a lot of times, and I don't know, you could tell me, I'm not familiar with Brazilian culture enough to know, but churches here that would be not liturgical would still end up grabbing a liturgy from something else, like it would come from something like a lecture, an academic lecture, and then a band playing, or a TED Talk, or a something that looks kind of corporate, or like a CEO kind of. What? Yeah, exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah, so it's kind of pulled from other places, and so what I'm saying is that I think that we, so I'm not Catholic doctrinally. There are obviously things that I think are right about the Catholic Church, but there's places that I I get off the train, right? I disagree doctrinally, and yet I think some of the, well, I don't know how controversial this is. I actually think that the early church, the pre-Reformation church, so that's not just the early church, the early medieval and even later church, belongs to all of us. That we are all inheritants of the ancient church. We're all the Holy Spirit didn't start working in the Reformation, that God was at work in people's lives that whole time. And that we, as all faithful Christians, can claim the prayers and the practices of the ancient church as their own, because we're all inheritants of that. And so the reason these had staying power, the reason they stuck around, is because there's truth and beauty in these practices. And so now, do I think liturgy saves us? No, of course not. And so if that, like, Jesus is our Savior alone, but I do think we need to think carefully about how we're being shaped and what we're being shaped by. And the fact is, there's just endless amounts of treasures and bounty in the historic church and thousands of years of church history of people who have loved Jesus and walked with Jesus and learned to pray and learned to worship, and we can learn from them. We too have to learn to pray, have to learn to worship in our own moment. And so being deeply rooted in things that are not passing fads, things that are ancient and eternal, is I think very good and important. And I think that we do have a call as Christians not to be Roman Catholic, but to be little c Catholic, to be universal, and that I think we need to pull the best from every single one of our traditions, and to mine the great broader Christian tradition, because this was Jesus at work. The story of Jesus continues through the story of the church, and so there are these so much brokenness and fallenness and sinfulness in the church, of course, but also God has worked and there's glory in it. And so that's one thing I'd say. I mean, the second thing I'd say also is just, you're going to be shaped and formed by what you do again and again. And so looking at what those things are, where they came from, is very important. I mean, here in the States, and my guess is this would be the same elsewhere as well, but Christians are profoundly shaped by consumption of certain kinds of media. Like, there's a whole group of kind of conservative Christians that have been deeply, deeply shaped by talk radio. But this is a liturgy. They go the same time every day. It marks their seasons. They know what to expect. And it shapes the way they see the world. And so what I would say is we're all liturgical animals. Like, we're all shaped by the liturgies that we possess. And so, or that we inhabit is a better way of saying that. And so, where do we get those? Do we get those from secular culture, or do we learn those from the church? And yeah.
Nice. Yeah, that's a very good response. Well, I'd like now to go to the other book, to Pray in the Night. And sadly, I don't have it with me yet, but I think it's safe to say that your new book is a kind of a meditation about vulnerability, right? Springing from our personal experience, and this office called compliance or compliance. I don't know exactly how to say it.
So people say it both ways. I say compline, but a lot of people have said, people have asked me that. But so I say compline.
Okay, yeah. So I'll say compliance also. Well, but can you share with us what motivated you to write this book?
Yeah. I didn't want to write this book at the beginning. I'll say that. So this book comes out of a story of my own life. 2017 was a really hard year for me. We moved across the country. A week after I moved, my father back in Texas passed away. And then suddenly, in the middle of the night. And then we found out right afterwards that we were pregnant, and 3 weeks later, which we had wanted to be for a long time. 3 weeks later, we had a miscarriage, and then we got pregnant again, and then had a long, hard pregnancy where I was on bed rest for part of it, and it was complicated pregnancy. And then we lost our second pregnancy, a little boy, in our second trimester in that July. So that was 6 months of just it wasn't unheard of catastrophe. I mean, there's a lot of Christian books that are sort of about deep, like, or just sort of unspeakable suffering or tragedy, or kind of freak accidents or terminal illnesses, or and this is not that. This is in some ways ordinary suffering. It's things a lot of people go through. A lot of us lose a parent. A lot of us are lonely and move and miss friends, or there's a pregnancy loss is really common. So, but I was spiritually exhausted. I was worn out, and I had these questions that had come up for me before. I mean, by this time I'd been to seminary. I knew the answers, but I found them deeply unsatisfying, about questions about how can God be good and loving and powerful, and bad things still regularly happen in the world. And so this question of, you brought up vulnerability. Why does God allow us to continue in vulnerability? When we become Christians, we could be sort of rescued out of that, but he doesn't do that. So why is that? And so I wrote this book to kind of wrestle with that, and specifically that I struggled to pray. I found it really difficult to know how to pray in the middle of these questions, but I wanted to continue to walk in the way of Jesus, but I didn't know how. And I didn't know how to do that in a way that was very honest about where I was and what I was struggling with, and wasn't sort of just trying to paint over, put a happy face on deep struggle and deep questions. And so I write in the book that I was a priest that didn't know how to pray, or that couldn't pray. And so what brought me back to prayer were these received prayers from the church, particularly nighttime prayer. Partly because during this time, night became really difficult for me. I had anxiety at night. I would get busy during the day to kind of keep these questions away, but slowing down at night would make these open spaces where all these sort of spiritual questions and struggles and grief, would come kind of roaring to the surface. And so these prayers, the book is not really an apologetic for praying Compline. So I don't care if your readers at the end, if they don't want to pray Compline, or if they think, well, as you said, this is just too Catholic and I can't do it. That's fine. The book is more that it's framed by one of these prayers, but it really uses that prayer to get into these bigger questions of how do you trust God if God will not keep bad things from happening to us. And but it's a really practical approach to that. The theological term for that is Theodicy. And this would be which is usually handled very philosophically as kind of a question. And my book approaches it much more as as something to endure. And so it's a practical theodicy, in that it focus on what are the practices and habits and Christian practices that we've inherited from the church and from Jesus himself, from the scriptures, that teach us to continue to walk in the way of Jesus when things are very dark, and when we are full of doubt, and when things are very hard.
Yes. And when you wrote this book, were you suffering still grief, or you had passed over it?
Yeah, that's a good. Well, so I said I didn't want to write this book at first. It's because I probably a year after this all started happening, or was when I got the idea for this book. And I was actually on a writing retreat trying to write a different book, and on a walk, this kind of came to me, and I was like, oh, Lord, I don't want to write this book. I don't want to write it for a couple of reasons. But one of them was that I felt like I was just starting to move forward. I was just starting to kind of get this behind me, move forward. So I was like, ugh, I don't want to have to go back and look at all of the pain again. And then if I put this out, everyone's going to tell me about all the pain in their life. And I just thought, I just don't want to go back into the darkness of this, right? And but I think I was trying to, I just knew once that this book came to me, I had to write it. And it felt like this cat nipping at my heels. I couldn't get rid of it. And once you feed, a cat and it just keeps coming back to your house, and you're never gonna, eventually you think, okay, well, this is my cat now. And it felt like that with the book. And so, I was hesitant, because I felt like, no, I want to move on. But I think part of it is I wanted to move on too quickly. I wanted to, the book that I was writing was more overtly theological. This is a deeply theological book, but it was about the creed specifically. It's still unwritten. But I think in some ways I was using theology to avoid my real and central theological question. And so it felt like God was not going to allow me to get away that easily, and wanted me to kind of spend some time really sitting with my questions and struggles with God and with whether or not he was good, because it felt like I was very quick to want to move from that and to just go back into joy or go back into something easier. And it felt like it felt like a calling, I guess, to sit and to face the questions with the Lord and to walk into this and look at it. So I ended up writing the book.
And did it transform you writing this book? Would you say that? Or
yeah, so it's hard for me to talk about transformation because I don't know how dramatic that should look. But what I can say is that I trust God now in a way that I did not when I began writing this book. That it took me writing 80,000 words and whittling it down to about half of that over about 2 years to be able to walk into trust in God in a new way. And I think that's a continuous process. So maybe 10 years from now, I'll say, oh, I now trust God in a way I didn't then, right? But I do think this book, I think that this was a way that God wanted me to sort of sit with him and wrestle with these questions. And the process of sitting and wrestling with these questions has changed me indelibly for the rest of my life. And I think I ultimately just really think I believe in the love of God more than I did before I wrote this book. And that all of my hope is in Jesus restoring all things and making all things new. And I would have said that before, but I think that is the preoccupation of my thoughts and my heart in a way now that it wasn't before. I've really just come to think either this Christian story is real and true, or there's no hope. I mean, let's go to nihilism and just basically make our lives as comfortable as possible for the short time we are here, can be on this earth. So my eggs are all in that basket in a way they weren't before. Like the whole hope, I think, is the resurrection and the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come, as the creed would say. That so I think in a new way my heart kind of is hooked on the Christian story as the only answer to darkness, the only answer to evil in the world. I have not come across a better answer to the problem of pain or the reality of darkness.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Well, you say on your book that you will not address this pandemic, right? But I think a lot of people would like to know if you could add a chapter about this COVID-19, what would it look like?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I finished the book before the pandemic. And so, there's not much, I mean, there's nothing about the pandemics explicitly in it, but it's uncanny how it ended up being so timely. I mean, the book is about grief and mortality. There's a whole chapter on sickness, and dealing with the reality of death and all of our deep vulnerability. And even during COVID, so many people have told me they've struggled with nighttime specifically, and anxiety at night, and why does God allow global pandemic, right? And so the themes of the book ended up very appropriate for 2020, but the book was entirely written before then. So there's nothing that I think is just the Holy Spirit, and so leading all of that. So I don't know what I would add specifically about if I had to do a chapter on the pandemic. And it's really hard too, because I don't know what it's like in Brazil, but here in America, people have responded so differently to the pandemic, where some have been really cautious and taken it very seriously, and some really haven't, and have really belittled it and said this is nothing to worry about. Has that happened where you are?
Yeah, it's exactly the same thing, you know.
Yeah.
Even politically, I should say, even in politics, it's very similar.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. I mean, I know about a little bit about what's happening with Brazilian politics and how it's been sort of similar to what's some of the things happening here in the States, in the United States. So, yeah, is it regional too? Because here, like where I am, well, not Austin, but different states and different regions have responded really differently. So I don't know if it's geographic.
Yeah, maybe politically it is, but not on the personal level. I should say that everybody here is facing the same problems. Sometimes there's a state that it's facing a specific crisis on the health system, but overall, I think we are all in the same boat.
Yeah, and I think so. So in terms of what I would write about with that, it's been interesting to me. I thought that one of the sort of assumptions in my book is that we often avoid mortality, or we often avoid thinking about death. We want to get busy and we don't want to think about darkness or death. And not just mortality, but we avoid these hard questions. And the church by that too. We can sort of say, oh, just, focus on the bright side. Jesus is resurrected. And that's true. Jesus is resurrected. But sin continues, brokenness continues, death continues in the world, and it's absolutely okay. I mean, in fact, we are told to grieve, to weep, to mourn as those with hope. And so we need to hold to hope, but we also hold to mourning in the midst of that. And Jesus is resurrected, but also Jesus was crucified. And not all, we're living in the strange already, not yet, kind of between the decisive battle being won, but victory not being complete. Jesus's work was finished on the cross, and yet we see in Revelation, Jesus says again, when he makes all things new, he says, it is finished, right? So we're between these two finishes in some sense, between the finished work of Jesus on the cross and the finished work of the restoration of all of creation and all of humanity. So, we live in the meantime. And I think, I talk about how we sort of avoid that. We kind of avoid darkness and we avoid mortality. And I thought that when COVID first began, I thought that might change things, that might make people sort of face their own grief and loss and mortality in a new way. And I think that's happened a little, but by and large, I've been shocked at how much that hasn't happened, at how even in the face of mass global death, people, instead of going, I can say for sure, it feels in the United States at least that we haven't had true, deep lament or grief as a culture. We didn't even have a day of mourning until there was a ceremony of mourning the night before Joe Biden was inaugurated. But besides that, there was never a day of mourning or a time of mourning. After 9/11 here, there was real public mourning, and it didn't last long, but there was a time of public mourning. And for this, there really hasn't been any public mourning. And people have gone to outrage, being very angry. It's been more politically divisive than before. And so instead of saying, instead of kind of, we're all mortal here, we're all broken, we're all going to die. No politician can save us from that. There hasn't been this sort of there's not been unity around the fact that we are all deeply vulnerable and deeply mortal. Instead, we've gone to what I really think is a liturgy of outrage and recrimination and political polarization and blame, and so people have kind of retreated to what's comfortable to them and to the habits and liturgies we've learned of dealing with grief, which continues to be avoidance, continues to be outrage, continues to be sometimes belittling the reality of the situation. And so I've been amazed how it feels like a global pandemic should be a moment of reckoning where we really can mourn and remember our creatureliness and for the church, at least, to turn to hope in Jesus and love of neighbor. I mean, that's the church's response to plagues of old would be to go towards them, to walk towards caring for the sick. And we see that actually mostly in Christian healthcare workers that have really been heroes throughout this and put their lives on the line for those that are sick. But the church in America, in the United States at least, has been very divided over their response to COVID, and has been often not really the leader in kind of bringing unity and peace and service of neighbors. So I've been honestly shocked at how little it's made a kind of a global reckoning with our own mortality. We've sent people to the moon. we have iPhones. We have more knowledge in the palm of our hand than my grandmother could have ever imagined. And yet we have this inescapable human creatureliness, that none of that can rescue us from death. This tiny virus, this invisible threat, can bring the world to a halt, right? And so it shows that for all of our great human knowledge and technological ability, at the end of the day, we're so limited, we're so creaturely. But I haven't seen a real facing of that and a kind of emotional response to that. I think we've gone back into the same old habits that we formed before. And so, I mean, one thing I have found in my own life is that when I have times of real struggle, of real grief, of real loss, of real brokenness, I default into the habits that I've set before, for good or for ill. So if that's prayer and being with friends, then I do that, or binge watching Netflix, right? Or binge watching whatever. Or staying up too late and, as they say here, doom scrolling. Like, just, I don't even know. But that's a saying.
Understand completely.
But so I think it's the same culturally. We've just sort of both political parties sort of just defaulted to what they do and to blaming the other side. But because of that, we haven't really mourned. We haven't really been broken in the way that I think would be appropriate by the heaviness of this burden of death that we've bared this year, and the way that that's ricocheted not only through loss of life but through our economic system, and people are really struggling, right? And but we haven't mourned, but we also haven't rejoiced. I mean, that's been the interesting thing, is since I actually had to cancel last week on this podcast because I got my second COVID shot and was sick from it. But what a gift. I mean, I feel so blessed that I was able to get a vaccine. And so, when the polio vaccine arrived in the world, in America, there was a ticker tape parade in Times Square. It was a parade. People were rejoicing. People were shouting from the skyscraper windows when the vaccine arrived. There was widespread celebration. And what I've seen that's been really shocking to me about COVID is that we've had neither grief to the extent that I think we ought to, nor celebration about the incredible mercy that this might soon be over. I mean, I hope that we might soon globally even be able to move. At least we're making some significant progress. So I feel I don't know exactly what I'd say. That was a really long answer, but I think what I'm saying is that I've been surprised how little it's changed about how we approach grief and loss and our own human vulnerability.
Well, that was very helpful. Thank you. So you mentioned outrage culture, right? So we have a lot of evangelicals active on social media here in Brazil as well. We even call them web crentes or web believers in English. And it's funny how we replicate some patterns we observe on the wider culture online, right? Like outrage culture, yeah. So what would you say to those people so involved, in the church with online critiques, deconstructions, and those prophetic call-outs? What would you say to this, gospel outrage culture?
Yeah. That's an interesting question. That's a good question, because here's what makes this difficult, is that, of course, like, we have prophets in Scripture. We need we need the prophetic voices that are calling out the sin in the church. We desperately need that. It's a kindness of God to allow that, because the church needs to repent for so much. And yet, very skeptical if particularly calling out and the kind of outrage culture that you're saying happens online. I'm not sure that it does much to actually bring real repentance or bring reform. It often feels like it's about voicing our own self-righteousness publicly. And I genuinely have not figured out a response to this because, the web is here to stay. Like the toothpaste is out of the tube, as they say, the horse is out of the barn. So it's not, we're not going to all go back to quietly having conversations and writing letters to the editor of our local newspaper. And so, of course, I don't want to be legalistic. God can use and redeem these internet spaces. And yet I think that they're so prone to abstraction. So we're outraged about the larger problems of the church where we're not actually dealing with our local church and our people and our neighborhood and our actual context. And Eugene Peterson used to say there's no theology without geography. All theology is geographical. Well, what he meant by that, of course, wasn't that, the gospel is different for me in Texas than it is for you in Brazil. Like, Jesus redeemed us both. He's the hope of the whole world. And yet, the message of Jesus always comes in a very particular context to a very concrete, small community of people. And so I think when the problem with the internet is that it's so makes us so prone to abstraction and not really connected to our local communities and the problems therein. So it makes the sin out there instead of in here, instead of something I have to look at in my own life, right? Instead of the problem is those bad Christians out there, the injustice out there, the conservatives or the liberals, instead of looking at my own life. The other thing I would say with that is, and I bring this up in the book, is that underneath outrage is always fear or grief. So the way to respond to outrage is not simply to say, oh, quiet down, or don't worry about it, or you're overreacting, or to, belittle people's concerns, because their concerns are real, often for things like justice and truth and repentance. But it's also not to meet the outrage with your own outrage. Like because then it's just outrage meets outrage meets outrage, and it just keeps escalating, right? But to really look at the grief and the fear underneath. And so I say, if we are going to, as a church, resist being taken over by outrage, we can't simply be a rational or reasonable culture, or we can't go to cold rationality or apathy, of course, which would even be worse. We have to be a culture of lament. We have to learn to grieve. We have to learn to grieve the sins in the church and the sins in our own lives. I think lament is a proper response to outrage. Now, are there moments that outrage is okay? Of course, we see this in Jesus, right? He turns over tables. In the temple, he was angry. But I think prophetic people on the internet, web believers, as apparently they're called, they look at that one passage and use that, and maybe the occasional hard remark by Paul to justify any level of constant outrage or unkindness. And what I want to say, it was, if Jesus turned over tables in the temple every day, first of all, he didn't, but second, everyone would just assume he was a crazy person, and he it would just be like, there's Jesus turning over the tables again. It was the fact that that was so out of character, right? That was a moment that was not common. So I think there are moments where and then that is an example. The poor were being exploited in the name of worship, and it was a whole system of power that was oppressing people in the name of God. And in that moment, to say this, for Jesus to make this very public stand against it, was the prophetic call. Jesus was prophet, priest, and king. But the point is that we can't take that and justify unkindness to people, and we can't take that and justify constant outrage, because that was uncharacteristic of the ministry of Jesus, which is what in part made it so powerful. If outrage becomes simply our mode of being, then we are, what the ancients would have said, we're just controlled by our passions, right? We are overtaken by our passions, instead of outrage being an engine, like the spark and the engine of the spark of a engine actually causes movement, right? It has a catalyst. It's not just the difference between an explosion in my living room that just burns everything down versus an explosion in an engine, is that explosion really fuels and makes momentum of movement. And so I just think that a lot of what we see online is outrage for the sake of outrage. It's an explosion in the living room. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't do anything. It just burns things down. It just deconstructs. And deconstruction without a clear vision of reconstruction is often leaves things worse than they were before. And so we need outrage. We do, but we need it. We don't need to be a people who are controlled by outrage. Outrage or anger is a right response to injustice, but we can't be controlled by it. We have to be people who wield it like a tool, instead of who are simply reactive. Because if we're just kind of reacting to what's around us, we're not actually building anything. We're not actually helping.
Nice. So what should we do to help? You have spoken in your book about this dark period in your life, and what did you wish people did to you back then? What was the best thing that maybe in counseling or in pastoral care? I don't know, but how do you think we should respond to this suffering around us?
Well, people helped in all different ways for me, and I have a chapter in the book on work, which is a lot of sort of answering your question. And so I would start with people helped through their own vocation. So I was deeply helped by physicians in the middle of this because I was sick, right? And my actual personal doctor, it was a believer and prayed for me and was available for me, was highly competent, was well studied, did her job well. And that was a great blessing to me in the middle of this. I did have a counselor in the middle of this who was who continues to be, I still am seeing her, who was incredibly helpful. So through our vocations, right? Through your vocation as a publisher and by making good books, by bringing truth and beauty in the world through the written word, you're pushing back the darkness, you're helping. So we can do this through our actual vocations, but also through the vocation of being a neighbor or a wife or a friend. We had people, some of the most meaningful things for me were people who were simply present. I mean, after my father died, a friend took me out, and there was a bottle of wine and a full box of Kleenex. And he and his wife took it was a husband and wife, and my husband and I went out with them, and they just asked questions for hours about my father, about what he liked, about what he was like, about my memories with him. And I just cried and cried. I mean, they brought a full bottle, a box of Kleenex, like I said, or tissues, and let me cry and were present. But also people dropped off food and brought art supplies to my kids in the middle of all this, because I was on bed rest and it was a hard time for them. So, but then of course there's even, I talk about the afflicted, those who are suffering from like profound poverty and mental illness, and there's of course ways to join God, to volunteer and to join God's work among the afflicted. So I talk in the book about watching for God at work, and then joining God in the work God is already doing. And so, because we aren't just passive, we are, by God's mercy, allowed to be workers who push back against the darkness, who actually Jesus uses to bring light and truth and redemption in the world. Jesus will make all things new, but he's doing that now through his church, through his people. So through our jobs, through our vocation, but also through the non-paying work in our life, volunteering, being a friend. But a lot of that, I think a lot of that has to start with knowing your embodied community, being somewhere, loving where God has put you, whether you actually like it or not, but loving, seeking to know the place you're at, and loving the people around you with the needs that they have, and in the world. And I mean, in your actual neighborhood and block and city. So I'm not saying that has nothing to do with what we do on the internet, but I think that that's not the primary way we can help people. People need embodied love.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So we will start to wrap it up right now. I would like to ask some quick questions for you.
Okay.
More personal questions, but I think it will be fun. So, do you prefer coffee or tea?
Oh, that's tough. Because I love both. I love both. I drink tea before I think if I had to pick one, I'd pick tea. But the truth is, I drink tea before noon, and I drink coffee after noon.
What would be your favorite theologian?
I only can pick one in the whole world. I don't think I could pick one.
Yeah, on the whole church history, just one.
I don't think I could pick one. Man, I don't think I could pick one. I genuinely do not think so. But if I had to pick one, okay. Well, Augustine would be, because I just think everyone in the West has been deeply influenced by Augustine, whether you think you have or not, you have. But particularly his view of sin and grace just slays me. It's the best, and it's revolutionary in the world. So Augustine and his views on sin and grace have been incredibly helpful. Okay, I might get in slight trouble for this too, particularly from my husband. He actually doesn't always love this about me, but Luther has been a huge influence on me, particularly again his view of grace. Grace has been a huge grace is the Christian doctrine of grace is a huge part of why I'm a Christian. It just overwhelms me often, and so Luther had a lot of problems, and certainly I'm very aware of that. But he really saw himself as a sinner in need of grace, and I love that. Let me see some more recent ones. Stanley Hauerwas has had a big influence on me. Richard Hayes has had a big influence on me. Dorothy Day has had a big influence on me. Michael Ramsey is he was an Archbishop of Canterbury, and his writing he writes beautifully. So I love theologians that write beautifully. And then more contemporary writers would be Eugene Peterson has had a huge impact on me, and so those are some. Those are a lot of white. Everyone I said was, except for one person, was a white man. So sorry. Need to work on that, I guess. But yes.
Yeah. What would be the travel of your dreams?
The travel? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Do I need to say going to Brazil because I'm talking to you?
No,
The travel of my dreams. That's such a good question. I really would love to go to India. I've never been to India, and I would love to go to India. I just would love to see the whole country top to bottom. That would be pretty dreamy. Maybe India. Or Thailand also would be up on my list. I would love to travel around Europe. That's actually something I've never done. I've been to Europe, but I haven't. I've never taken a train around, and so to train around Europe would be wonderful.
What do you wish evangelicals would change in their theology?
That's interesting. Evangelicals have too long been defined by what they're against or what they're not. They really, in many ways, and have formed their identity as in response, in reaction. We're not Catholic or we're not liberals. And instead, I want them to be more defined by what they are for. Evangelicals have theoretically such a deep love for Scripture. And I would like that to mark us more, because I think it's easy. Scripture actually will just continuously blow apart cultural categories. But instead, we often read our own cultural categories back onto Scripture. And so to truly let Scripture speak to us. The other thing is I would love for evangelicals to draw more from the resources of the ancient and the broader Christian tradition, 2,000 years of church history. That the evangelical movement shouldn't be this sort of little island separate from this great work God is doing through his whole church, but should be a manifestation, a beautiful manifestation that is connected to this broader movement of the church throughout time, including in the Catholic faith and the Eastern Orthodox faith, or I shouldn't even say faith because it's the same faith, but in the traditions of that. And I don't mean, I obviously don't mean to give up the evangelical distinctives of doctrine, but I do mean that a lot of times, again, those distinctives have been formed in a particular cultural moment and response and reaction. And I think we need to get past just the reaction to drill down. Justin Martyr, a martyr in the early church, said everything good and beautiful belongs to us, meaning anything that is kind of true and good and beautiful we can learn from. And so I think particularly for Christians, everything good and beautiful in the Christian tradition belongs to every one of us. And so to learn to read the Scriptures with the early church and with other people, that's there's Alexander Campbell very famous evangelical from the United States, was part of the revivalist movement in the Second Great Awakening. He said, "I endeavor to read the scriptures as if no one before me has ever read them. So I want to read them completely in isolation from anyone else throughout history and time, and throughout any other person in community." So it's an absolutely individualistic understanding of reading the scriptures. And I think it's wrong. We were never meant to read the scriptures as if no one has ever read them before us. Thank God. The scriptures themselves are received. And so I think I want evangelicals to continue to love the scriptures, to find their whole authority and the whole basis for truth in the scriptures. But we cannot read it in isolation as if no one has ever read it before. And so we need to read this in community with one another and with the global and historic church.
Yeah, that's a very good answer. So, do you have any new writing projects going on lately?
Yes. The things that I'm working on now, I have a book coming out it's just a part of a series with other folks that's called the Fullness of Time series, and it's small volumes on the Christian year, on the Christian calendar. So there's one on Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, each of the Lent, Easter, and then Pentecost. And so 6 of us are writing it together, each individual volumes, and then it will be combined to you can either buy them individually or together. And mine is on Advent. So I'm working on that. It's not Advent, but I'm still having to write on Advent in the middle of Easter. And then I also have a children's book coming out. It's a book of prayers for children, probably ages about 4 to 11 or 12. And it's similar to Liturgy, the Ordinary, in that it follows an ordinary day of a kid's life, and it's little prayers for different moments. So prayers for a ride in the car, prayers for bedtime, prayers for brushing your teeth before you brush your teeth, prayers for the end of a school day, the beginning of a school, or the beginning of a school day, the end of the school day, bath time, that sort of thing. So those are some, I'm always working. And then I continue, I have a column at Christianity Today, and I had an article come out today that has a lot to do with your question about the internet and the web believers, and me kind of wrestling with if talking about God, if arguing specifically about God and talking about God this much online actually makes it more difficult to worship God in the way that we are called to remember that God is transcendent above all these things. So, yeah, so I have a column still.
That's nice. So, I would say, do you have any interest coming over to Brazil in the future? Maybe when this pandemic comes?
I would absolutely love to come to Brazil. I don't know any Portuguese, unfortunately. My husband is fluent in Spanish. But that doesn't help in Brazil. But I would love to. I would really, really love to. Here's a confession. I've never even been to the continent. Like, I've never been to South America. I've been to Central America. And my husband lived in Peru for a while, but I've never been there. So please have me. I would love to come.
Well, we would love to have you here too. And I think this will be our last question. I think you have noticed through your Twitter account that some Brazilians started following you, interacting with you. You have attracted a wide readership in Brazil. So what message would you like to give to these readers, your readers here?
Thank you, first of all. Thank you so much. Often people are tweeting about me and I don't know what they're saying because it's in Portuguese. So I don't respond and I don't retweet because I don't know if they're saying this is wonderful or this lady is the worst. But the message that I feel for the church, and I often say this to the American church, but I think you can say the same thing to the church in Brazil right now, is truly, it sounds cliche, but I'm going to state the obvious because I feel called to do that, is to do not be afraid. I think the church has become so marked by fear in the world, and Christians are often so concerned or worried about being marginalized or facing hardship, that because of that we can put our hope in all kinds of very flimsy things, from politics to political leaders to like a strongman political leader to consumerism, to trying to fit in or make our message palatable, kind of. And we do all of these things because we are afraid, and we're looking for a rescuer, we're looking for a ransom, a redeemer. But I just want to say, like, truly, truly, in this world, you will have tribulation, like you will have trials. Don't be surprised, but the hope is not that we'll solve it or fix it. The hope is that in this world you will have trials, but be of good cheer. Jesus has overcome the world. And so the fact that Jesus has overcome the world needs to make a material and significant difference in our ordinary life, that we can walk through the world with a kind of kindness and levity and kind of like a holy apathy in some ways. I don't mean apathy about injustice, but I mean that we don't have to be the masters of our own life. We can let go in a way that is really freeing. But I think that we often have an admixture of the gospel and fear that is not. It's enslavement. So do not be afraid. That would be my message to your church in Brazil.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Even though it's morning, can we pray that collect from the contents? Could you lead us in prayer with that collect?
Sure. The Keep Watch, dear Lord, the book's over. Okay. Keep watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night, and give your angels charge over those who sleep. Tend the sick, Lord Christ. Give rest to the weary. Bless the dying. Soothe the suffering. Pity the afflicted. Shield the joyous. And all for your love's sake. Amen.
Thank you, Tish. It was very nice to have you here. We have learned a lot, and I bet our readers will have learned as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.